In the spring of April 1945, General George S. Patton's Third Army surged through southern Germany with remarkable speed. American armored columns and infantry units overran vast areas, often capturing entire towns and villages before organized German defenses could form. The rapid advance left little time for resistance. In many places, Wehrmacht and Volkssturm units simply melted away, retreating eastward or surrendering en masse. This left local civilians to confront the arriving Americans alone. As U.S. troops approached, a strikingly similar scene unfolded repeatedly across Bavaria, Franconia, and other regions. From windows, rooftops, and doorways hung improvised white flags, bed sheets, pillowcases, tablecloths, towels, or any white fabric residents could find. These symbols of surrender fluttered in the breeze, signaling that the community had given up without a fight. Streets stood eerily empty, devoid of German military presence, as soldiers had fled or hidden their uniforms. American soldiers, cautious after years of combat, advanced house by house, kicking in doors or calling out for occupants to emerge. From cellars, basements, and air raid shelters, German civilians slowly appeared, families huddled together, faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Women often led the way, clutching infants or holding children's hands, while elderly men and teenagers followed. The air was thick with tension as GI pointed rifles, searching for hidden weapons or SS holdouts. The civilians' first words revealed raw, immediate priorities: personal safety, the protection of their children, and sheer survival. Mothers, in particular, voiced profound terror, pleading in broken English or gesturing desperately. "Please don't hurt us," many said, or "We have children, don't shoot." Others insisted, "We have done nothing wrong," or "We are only civilians." These pleas stemmed from a toxic mix of sources. Nazi propaganda had spent years demonizing Allied troops, especially Americans, as gangsters who would rape, pillage, and murder indiscriminately. Goebbels' ministry amplified horror stories from the Eastern Front about Soviet atrocities, warning that the West would be no better. Yet these fears also drew from legitimate historical anxieties. Conquering armies throughout history had often abused civilians, and rumors of isolated incidents by Allied soldiers circulated. Women bore the brunt of this dread, having heard endless broadcasts about, to the surprise of many Germans, American forces generally behaved with remarkable discipline. Strict orders from commanders like Patton and Eisenhower prohibited looting, rape, or unnecessary violence against non-combatants. Troops were instructed to search homes thoroughly for arms, but to treat families humanely. Soldiers' personal letters and diaries capture moments of visible relief. A woman's tense shoulders relaxing as GI handed out chocolate to children instead of harm. Families emerging fully from hiding only after realizing no brutality would follow. One infantry lieutenant stationed near Frankfurt recorded in a letter home how a middle-aged German woman approached him cautiously, saying she had fully expected the Americans to shoot everyone in the village. Instead, after a quick search, the soldiers moved on, leaving the family untouched. Such accounts multiplied, highlighting the contrast between propaganda-fueled expectations and reality. Another pervasive theme in these initial encounters was the rapid disavowal of the Nazi regime. Almost as soon as safety seemed assured, civilians declared, "We never supported Hitler," or "We were forced to go along," or "We always opposed the Nazis in our hearts." Some claimed they had only joined the party for jobs or to avoid suspicion, while others insisted their town had quietly resisted. This chorus became so ubiquitous that it sparked bitter humor among American troops. One sergeant quipped in his diary, "If all these Germans who say they hated Hitler are telling the truth, then the Führer must have conquered half of Europe all by himself." While some claims held truth, genuine anti-Nazis did exist, including those who had suffered under the regime. The sheer volume raised skepticism. Troops noted how even obvious beneficiaries, like local party officials, suddenly professed lifelong opposition. Beyond pleas and denials, civilians swiftly turned to practical matters. They asked about occupation rules. Can we keep our homes? Will there be food rations? How long will you stay? May we reopen shops? Town mayors or burgomeisters who formally surrendered often prioritized infrastructure, ensuring water pumps worked, electricity flowed if possible, and bread distribution continued to avert famine. One mayor told advancing officers his chief worry was preventing starvation in the coming weeks. Not political ideology. This pragmatic focus underscored a broader pattern. Many ordinary Germans framed the war's end through the lens of personal and communal survival. After 12 years of totalitarian rule, 6 years of total war, and months of devastating air raids, exhaustion dominated. Ideological fervor had waned for most. The collapse brought not just defeat, but a desperate hope for stability. Religious appeals sometimes surfaced in Catholic Bavaria, where civilians hoped shared faith with many American soldiers, including Irish or Italian descendants, might earn mercy. Chaplains occasionally intervened to protect churches. Age and gender influenced interactions too. Elderly residents, remembering the relatively mild Allied occupation after World War I, sometimes expressed cautious optimism. Young children, indoctrinated in schools, initially eyed soldiers warily, but warmed quickly to treats. Teenage boys, many fresh from Hitler Youth, ranged from sullen defiance to relief at avoiding conscription into suicidal Volkssturm units. These first encounters set the tone for the occupation ahead. American troops, hardened yet bound by rules, found themselves not as conquerors in a hostile land but as reluctant administrators of a broken populace. The white flags marked not just military surrender but the abrupt end of a regime that had dominated every aspect of life. For civilians, emerging from basements into an uncertain new world meant navigating fear, relief, denial, and the urgent demands of daily existence. What began as moments of high tension often evolved into tentative coexistence, laying groundwork for the complex interactions that would follow as Third Army pushed deeper into the crumbling Reich. The rapid advance of General Patton's Third Army through southern Germany in April 1945 brought American forces face with the most horrific evidence of Nazi crimes, the concentration camps. On April 4, 1945, elements of the 4th Armored Division and 89th Infantry Division liberated Oehrdruf, a sub-camp of the notorious Buchenwald complex near Gotha. What the soldiers encountered defied comprehension, even for men who had fought across Europe and witnessed countless battlefields. Emaciated survivors, barely alive, staggered toward their liberators. Piles of corpses lay stacked like cordwood, many partially burned or sprinkled with lime to mask the stench. Makeshift gallows, torture devices, and facilities clearly designed for mass killing revealed the systematic nature of the murders. Combat veterans, hardened by years of war, stood in stunned silence or turned away in revulsion. One soldier later described the scene as beyond human imagination. Facebook, Comnation Uluwatu Museum, Org Arlington Cemetery, Miller Olson Archives. Org news of the discovery reached higher command quickly. On April 12, 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, accompanied by Generals Omar Bradley and George S. Patton, toured Oehrdruf personally. The visit was deliberate. Eisenhower wanted to bear witness himself and ensure the world could never dismiss these atrocities as propaganda. The sights overwhelmed even these battle-tested leaders. Patton, known for his iron stomach amid combat carnage, refused to enter one shed containing dozens of lime-covered bodies. Outside another building, the famously tough general vomited violently, a rare moment of physical breakdown for a man who had seen death on every front. Perspectives, Org Facebook, Comblog, Fold 3, Comradit, Comarmy History. Org Eisenhower's reaction was immediate and decisive. He ordered that nearby German civilians be rounded up and forced to tour the camp, view the evidence firsthand, and participate in burying the dead. His explicit goal was twofold: to confront locals with undeniable proof of crimes committed in their nation's name and to eliminate any future possibility of collective denial. The German people must see this, he insisted, also inviting journalists and photographers to document everything for the historical record. This policy became standard procedure for every camp liberated by Third Army units, including the main Buchenwald camp near Weimar a week later. American military authorities viewed it as both a moral imperative and a strategic one, shattering the veil of ignorance or complicity that had allowed the system to operate. When German civilians, often well-dressed townspeople from nearby communities, were marched through the camps under guard, their reactions varied widely but were meticulously documented by soldiers, interrogators, and photographers. Many immediately insisted they had known absolutely nothing about the camp's true purpose. "We thought it was just a labor camp for criminals or political prisoners," they claimed, or "we never imagined such things could happen." Some denials seemed plausible. Certain camps were somewhat isolated, and the Nazi regime had enforced strict secrecy around the final solution. However, American observers grew increasingly skeptical as more camps were uncovered. At sites like Buchenwald, visible from nearby roads, with prisoner marches through towns and the unmistakable odor of crematoria carried on the wind, blanket ignorance strained credulity. Others admitted hearing vague rumors of terrible things happening to Jews or opponents, but explained they dared not ask questions. Fear of arrest or worse had silenced curiosity. A significant portion clung to denial even when confronted directly with corpses, ovens, and survivors' testimonies. Rationalizations poured forth. Bodies must have been transported from elsewhere after Allied bombings. Deaths resulted from typhus epidemics or food shortages caused by air raids, not deliberate murder. The SS had acted without local knowledge. These excuses infuriated GI, who had seen the deliberate design of extermination facilities and knew the truth. Yet genuine shock and horror appeared authentic in many cases. Observers noted civilians weeping uncontrollably, covering their faces with hands or handkerchiefs, turning away unable to stomach the sights, or standing frozen in disbelief. Women fainted, men grew pale and silent. The most publicized forced tour occurred at Buchenwald on April 16, 1945. Patton personally ordered approximately 1,000 residents of Weimar, a cultured city associated with Goethe and Schiller, bus to the camp. They were compelled to walk past truckloads of emaciated corpses piled outside the crematorium. View shrunken heads and lampshades allegedly made from human skin, and witness survivors' skeletal forms. Iconic photographs captured the scene. Well-fed Germans in civilian clothes averting eyes, some sobbing openly, others maintaining stony, impassive expressions that betrayed inner turmoil. Buchenwald, Debechenwald, Diana Frank, Orgstiftung, Jeddingsteden. To the diversity of responses highlighted that German civilians were not a monolith. Reactions spanned the spectrum of human emotion when forced to confront unimaginable evil. The most tragic and extreme outcome came in Ohrdruf itself. The town's mayor and his wife, after completing their compulsory tour of the camp, returned home and hanged themselves. This double suicide shocked American authorities and became a symbol of the profound psychological impact on at least some locals. Whether driven by personal guilt over complicity, overwhelming shame at Germany's moral collapse, despair over total defeat, or fear of impending punishment remains debated among historians. Whatever the motive, it underscored that the forced confrontations could shatter individuals completely. These encounters fundamentally altered American interactions with German civilians. Skepticism deepened toward claims of ignorance or opposition to the regime. The policy of mandatory tours laid the groundwork for post-war denazification and trials, ensuring visual and testimonial evidence would endure. For many Germans, April 1945 marked the irreversible shattering of illusions, thrusting them from denial into a harsh reckoning with the horrors enabled, however passively, in their midst. As the Third Army advanced through Germany, securing territory previously under Nazi control, civilian concerns gradually shifted from immediate reality of surrender to the longer-term uncertainties of life under occupation. In the early days, people were focused on survival, finding food, securing shelter, and avoiding the violence that often accompanied the collapse of government authority. However, as the initial shock of defeat faded, conversations among civilians increasingly centered on the practicalities of living under the Americans, the restoration of basic services, and the impact of Allied denazification policies. Food shortages were acute, as transportation networks had been destroyed, farmland had been abandoned, and supply chains disrupted by months of Allied bombing campaigns. Collapsed infrastructure left entire towns without electricity, water, or functional roads, making everyday life precarious. Amid this chaos, the policies designed to root out Nazi influence, though necessary, added another layer of tension to daily life as citizens debated who should be held accountable and how far the Allies should go in purging the old regime. Former members of the Nazi Party and government employees frequently approached American authorities to explain their past affiliations. Many insisted that they had joined the party solely for career advancement and had never actively harmed anyone. They argued that their technical expertise and administrative experience were essential to running local services such as hospitals, schools, utilities, and municipal governments, which were on the brink of collapse. In some cases, these arguments were persuasive. The U.S. occupation authorities recognized that while ideological loyalty to Nazism was dangerous, the sudden removal of all experienced officials could lead to chaos and further suffering among civilians. This created a delicate balance. The Allies had to enforce denazification policies without dismantling the very systems that kept communities functioning. At the same time, denunciations became a common and troubling feature of civilian life. Neighbors, co-workers, and even family members reported one another to the American authorities, sometimes motivated by genuine concerns about past crimes, but often driven by personal vendettas or the desire to demonstrate loyalty to the new occupiers. These denunciations could have serious consequences, ranging from temporary detention to loss of employment or social standing. The climate of suspicion that emerged contributed to a tense social atmosphere, as people became increasingly aware that their words and actions were being closely scrutinized. Women, particularly in regions bordering the future Soviet zone, frequently approached American soldiers with urgent pleas for protection. Fear of the advancing Red Army was intense. Refugees who had fled the East recounted horrific stories of mass rape, looting, and brutality, which spread panic and distrust westward. Many women begged the Americans not to withdraw, fearing that without Allied protection, they would be left vulnerable to Soviet forces. These personal appeals highlighted the profound gendered impact of the war and occupation, revealing how civilians, especially women, navigated multiple layers of danger and uncertainty. Encounters with American troops also brought stark revelations to German civilians about the material and technological superiority of the United States. Civilians were often astonished by the sheer abundance of American resources. Trucks, tanks, weapons, food supplies, and other equipment far exceeded anything they had been led to expect through Nazi propaganda. Contrast between what they had been told and what they witnessed firsthand was striking. Many civilians admitted that Germany could never have won a war against such overwhelming material power. The presence of well-supplied, well-trained, and disciplined troops challenged long-held beliefs about the supposed invincibility of German arms and the inevitability of Nazi victory. In addition to material abundance, the composition and conduct of American forces challenged Nazi ideological claims. Encounters with African American soldiers were particularly striking for German civilians, who had been subjected to years of racist propaganda portraying black people as inferior and subhuman. Civilians frequently expressed surprise at being treated respectfully by African American troops, contradicting their previous beliefs and propaganda-fed assumptions. This created moments of cognitive dissonance for many Germans, forcing them to reconsider deeply ingrained prejudices and assumptions about race, hierarchy, and human dignity. Overall, life under American occupation was a mix of relief, fear, and astonishment. Civilians navigated a world in which the familiar structures of power had collapsed, yet were simultaneously confronted with the overwhelming presence of a foreign, victorious army. Survival required adaptation to a new order, balancing fear of reprisal with opportunities for stability, and negotiating a complex social environment shaped by denazification, denunciations, and shifting gender and racial dynamics. The experiences of these civilians reveal the multidimensional challenges of occupation, the struggle to secure basic necessities, the moral and social consequences of previous affiliations, the pervasive fear of external threats, and the profound impact of exposure to a foreign culture and military power. Life under occupation was far from uniform, but the patterns that emerged highlight both the resilience of the German population and the transformative effects of contact with the Americans. Age and social background played a significant role in shaping how German civilians responded to life under American occupation. The experiences and perspectives of individuals varied widely depending on the generation they belonged to, their social class, and their proximity to the ideological and political structures of the Third Reich. Elderly Germans, in particular, often drew comparisons with earlier periods of foreign occupation. Those who had lived through the Allied occupation of the Rhineland in 1918 frequently remarked that the Americans were treating the population more humanely than they had anticipated. The experiences of post-World War I hardship and humiliation shaped both their expectations and their reactions, leading many to approach the American forces with cautious optimism. They noted, for instance, that soldiers distributed food and medical aid, respected private property, and generally avoided the punitive measures and abuses that had characterized earlier occupations. For these older Germans, witnessing a foreign army that conducted itself with discipline and a degree of fairness provided a sense of reassurance amid the wider social and economic chaos. Children and adolescents experienced the occupation in ways shaped by their limited life experience and the deep imprint of Nazi indoctrination. Children who had been raised entirely under the Third Reich often displayed initial confusion, fear, or hostility toward the Americans, accustomed to propaganda that portrayed the Allies as monstrous invaders. Many children were wary or suspicious at first. However, they adapted quickly in most cases, responding to small gestures of kindness, such as candy, toys, or playful interaction. Learning basic English phrases and observing the more personal, humane side of occupation allowed many children to reconcile the propaganda they had absorbed with the reality before them. Teenagers who had been active in the Hitler Youth displayed more complex and varied reactions. Some remained defiant, clinging to nationalist ideals and resisting contact with the occupiers, while others experienced relief that they would not be sent to die in what had become an increasingly hopeless conflict. This generational gap illustrated how childhood and adolescent experiences under the Nazi regime shaped responses to defeat and foreign authority. Social background also heavily influenced civilian attitudes. Working-class Germans tended to prioritize practical survival over ideological reflection. For many, everyday life under occupation meant securing food, finding shelter, and ensuring the well-being of their families. When questioned about their involvement in or support of the Nazi regime, many working-class individuals claimed that they had simply followed orders from elites who bore true responsibility for the war and its crimes. They emphasized their lack of real political agency, framing themselves as victims of circumstance rather than perpetrators. By contrast, educated professionals, including teachers, civil servants, and members of the intelligentsia, were more likely to offer nuanced critiques of German society and politics. These individuals acknowledged collective moral failure, reflected on the consequences of Nazi ideology, and often expressed support for fundamental political and social reform. Their statements revealed an awareness of the structural and ideological factors that had enabled the rise of the Third Reich, and a recognition of the need to rebuild both institutions and civic culture in the post-war period. Women, whose experiences during the war had been shaped by the near-total absence of men from families and communities, frequently framed their statements and concerns around the immediate needs of survival. With millions of German men either dead, missing, or imprisoned as prisoners of war, women were left as the primary caretakers of households. Their statements to American authorities and in community discussions often centered on securing housing, providing sufficient food for their children, and facilitating the return of husbands and male relatives from POW camps. These practical concerns were rooted in the necessity of ensuring family survival in a society disrupted by both wartime destruction and occupation policies. Women's perspectives also highlighted the gendered dimensions of the post-war crisis. Their labor, both domestic and economic, became a critical factor in maintaining social stability in the absence of men. Religious leaders, including Catholic and Protestant clergy, occupied a unique position within German society. Many had maintained a cautious distance from the Nazi regime, sometimes resisting its demands or preserving moral authority within their communities. In the immediate post-war period, these leaders spoke to themes of repentance, moral renewal, and ethical reflection, messages that were noted by American observers in early post-war sermons. Their calls for spiritual reflection and ethical accountability resonated with a population grappling with guilt, loss, and the moral vacuum left by the collapse of the Nazi state. Clergy often became intermediaries between civilians and occupying forces, helping to mediate tensions, promote social cohesion, and encourage moral as well as practical reconstruction efforts. Taken together, these diverse civilian responses reveal how age, social class, and life experience shaped German interactions with the occupying Americans. Elderly citizens drew upon memory and comparison to assess the behavior of foreign troops, while children and teenagers navigated propaganda, indoctrination, and personal safety to form evolving attitudes toward their occupiers. Working class populations focused on immediate survival and tended to distance themselves from ideological responsibility, whereas educated professionals engaged in deeper moral and political reflection. Women bore the brunt of family management and survival in the absence of men, highlighting the gendered realities of post-war life. Meanwhile, religious leaders sought to address the moral and spiritual needs of communities, advocating repentance and renewal as part of the broader social reconstruction. These patterns also illustrate the complex interplay between material necessity, psychological adaptation, and moral reckoning in a defeated society. Civilians were forced to reconcile propaganda, ideology, and lived experience with the reality of foreign occupation. They negotiated survival, responsibility, and ethical reflection simultaneously, creating a multifaceted portrait of human adaptation in the aftermath of total war. By examining the varied responses across age groups, social strata, and gender, historians gain insight into both the challenges of post-war occupation and the resilience and adaptability of German society in one of its most trying historical moments. By late April and early May 1945, as Germany's unconditional surrender became imminent, the mood among civilians reflected a complex mixture of relief, fear, resignation, and bitter reflection. After 6 years of total war, countless deaths, and the collapse of political and social structures, German civilians increasingly acknowledged that defeat was inevitable. Many expressed relief that the fighting would finally end, recognizing that the once mighty German war machine could no longer resist the overwhelming military power of the Allies. Privately, a significant number admitted that they had known for months, sometimes even years, that Germany was losing the war, but they had feared punishment for defeatism, a term that carried severe consequences under the Third Reich. Expressing doubts about victory or criticizing leadership could result in arrest, imprisonment, or worse, creating a climate in which private acceptance of defeat existed alongside public expressions of loyalty. This period also brought widespread, candid reflections on responsibility for Germany's prolonged suffering. Many civilians placed blame squarely on Hitler and the Nazi leadership, accusing them of refusing to surrender earlier and thereby prolonging pointless destruction. Cities were left in ruins, transportation networks shattered, and countless lives lost in the final chaotic months of the conflict. Some civilians expressed open contempt for Hitler's actions, including his decision to commit suicide rather than face capture. A few called his death cowardly, interpreting it as an evasion of responsibility for the catastrophic consequences of his policies. Such sentiments, while often privately voiced, reveal the growing willingness of ordinary Germans to confront the moral and political failures of the regime that had dominated their lives for over a decade. The advance of the Red Army played a decisive role in shaping civilian attitudes. refugees fleeing the Soviet advance carried harrowing accounts of atrocities including mass executions, rape, and widespread looting. These stories circulated rapidly, heightening fear of Soviet occupation and reinforcing a preference for American control in the western zones. Civilians who had previously been uncertain about their attitudes toward the Americans now began to cooperate more eagerly with U.S. authorities, providing information, offering assistance in administration, and facilitating local governance. The stark contrast between the potential threat of Soviet occupation and the comparatively humane conduct of American forces created a pragmatic calculation among the population. Survival and stability depended on cooperation, regardless of ideological beliefs. Amid these anxieties and strategic calculations, the focus of most civilians shifted decisively from defending the collapsed regime to concerns about immediate survival and reconstruction. Communities faced enormous practical challenges. Cities were heavily bombed, transportation systems were destroyed, utilities were inoperable, and food supplies were critically low. Civilians concentrated on securing housing, organizing basic services, finding food, and caring for displaced family members. While some genuinely renounced Nazism and reflected morally on the consequences of their previous beliefs, many others adapted pragmatically, recognizing that survival under occupation required cooperation with authorities rather than continued ideological resistance. This pragmatic adaptation was not necessarily accompanied by ideological conversion. In many cases, it was a strategy of self-preservation in a drastically changed political environment. American officials were acutely aware of this complexity. While some civilian renunciations of Nazism appeared sincere, others seemed opportunistic, motivated more by fear or a desire for material security than by moral awakening. Military administrators and occupation authorities remained skeptical of sudden conversions, understanding that the practical necessities of governance, food distribution, law enforcement, and reconstruction required civilian cooperation whether or not it was accompanied by ideological loyalty. At the same time, officials recognized the importance of cultivating trust and collaboration, using a combination of moral authority, pragmatic concessions, and incentives to maintain order and facilitate reconstruction in the devastated regions. The preserved statements from this period, recorded in a variety of sources including military reports, soldiers' diaries, official interrogations, and testimonies of civilians themselves, provide a unique and intimate view of ordinary Germans confronting total military, moral, and political defeat. These statements reveal the complex psychological landscape of a population experiencing not only the end of a long and destructive war, but also the collapse of the ideological and social structures that had shaped their lives. Civilians expressed denial, attempting at times to minimize their own complicity or the scale of destruction. They engaged in self-protective reasoning, emphasizing obedience to orders or the coercive nature of the regime. Genuine shock and horror were common, as many had not fully grasped the consequences of total war until confronted with destroyed cities, displaced populations, and first-hand accounts of atrocities. And alongside all of these reactions, there was reluctant adaptation, as civilians quickly adjusted their behavior to accommodate the realities of occupation and survival under foreign authority. The narratives captured in these sources also highlight the diversity of civilian experience. Elderly citizens, who remembered the occupation after World War I, often drew comparisons between past and present, noting the relative restraint and humanitarian conduct of the Americans. Children and adolescents, raised entirely under Nazi propaganda, initially reacted with confusion or hostility, but adapted rapidly to new social norms, often engaging with American soldiers, learning English phrases, and accepting simple gestures of kindness. Working-class civilians focused on immediate survival and practical concerns, while educated professionals tended to engage with the broader moral and political dimensions of defeat, offering reflections on collective responsibility and the need for fundamental change. Women, bearing the dual burdens of household management and family survival, emphasized basic necessities such as food, shelter, and the safe return of male relatives. Religious leaders interpreted the crisis through moral and spiritual lenses, preaching repentance, ethical reflection, and community renewal. Taken together, these reactions illuminate a population in transition from indoctrinated subjects of a totalitarian regime to individuals navigating the practical, ethical, and psychological challenges of life under foreign occupation. Civilians' statements and behaviors reflect not a uniform experience but a tapestry of responses shaped by age, social status, gender, ideology, and proximity to danger. The spectrum ranges from denial and defensiveness to acceptance and moral reflection, illustrating the profound human complexity that arises in the aftermath of catastrophic defeat. Ultimately, the period of late April and early May 1945 marks a pivotal moment in German history. Civilians, confronted with the inevitability of defeat, began to confront both the practical realities and the moral consequences of the Third Reich's collapse. Their stories, preserved through diligent records of military observers, personal diaries, and oral testimonies, offer historians a rich window into the human dimensions of total defeat. They show how ordinary people managed fear, survival, and reflection simultaneously, providing insights into the broader processes of post-war reconstruction, denazification, and moral reckoning that would shape Germany for decades to come. These narratives underscore that the end of the war was not merely a political or military event, but a deeply human experience, defined by courage, fear, pragmatism, and the gradual confrontation with ethical responsibility.